Hi folks, Dr. Rob CYWES. I am the Carb Addiction Doc, and I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to biochemistry, physiology, and the science of how the body works, unfettered by industrial and religious overtones that falsify how we actually work. And my good friend, Dr. Tro Kalayjian, runs a wonderful practice up in New York, big growing practice called Toward Health. Very, very strong ketogenic practice. And Tro and I have been having a discussion about GLP-1s and GLP-1 medications. And this discussion is not going to be about GLP-1 medication. It's going to be understanding the physiology of how natural GLP-1 in the intestine, because we produce it in the intestine, how it works, and why the GLP-1 medications then work, and how, more importantly, how can you manipulate your own GLP-1s so you don't have to take Ozempic or Mounjaro. So Tro and I talked about this, and it was kind of interesting that Tro made a comment in one of the groups that we're in that said, oh, GLP-1s are triggered by fat. And I said, no. They're triggered by sugar, by glucose, by carbohydrates. And that started the discussion. And you know what's funny? We're both right. So this is how beautiful the human body works. So the way it works is we've got two major populations of GLP-1s. GLP-1s are hormones that get released from cells in the intestine, and we have them in the upper intestine just below the stomach, and we have another population in the bottom third of our small intestine, so toward the bottom end. And the intestine primarily does enzymatic digestion. Okay, the role of the intestine is to break the food that we eat into simple building blocks. So you've got glucose, galactose, fructose, amino acids, fatty acids. The enzymes in the intestine do that. And then the second role of the intestine is to facilitate an easy transfer of those basic building blocks and all the micronutrients in their simplest elemental form across the mucosa into both blood vessels and the lymphatics for storage, mostly in the liver and transformation in the liver, or for storage in the fat cells. That's what the small intestine does. And it passes that liquid through. But the small intestine also allows for hormonal interaction with certain hormones in the intestine that are released in response to the food we're eating to trigger a cascade of other hormones that are necessary to process the food and to handle our metabolic system and to handle hunger deeper in the body. Because remember, food only enters the body when it crosses the intestinal barrier. And then there are hormones on the other side of the blood system in certain organs that have to regulate what happens to that food. Okay? So GLP-1s and the incretin hormones, there are a few others, but GLP-1s, let's call it that, have an integral role in terms of signaling a hormonal cascade. Hey boys, get ready, this is coming in. And this is the beauty about the GLP-1s and why Tro and I were both correct. In the upper intestine, okay, so what happens is you eat food, doesn't matter what goes in your face, stomach churns that food up, acidifies it, and turns it to liquid. And the stomach then slowly regulates how fast you trickle that food into the small intestine. And the rate at which the stomach empties is controlled by two things: the nerves, the vagus nerve, but more acutely by the upper intestinal GLP-1. So the GLP-1 senses how much food, how much basic substrate is coming, how much food is coming into the upper intestine, and then speeds up or slows down stomach emptying. And there's a role that the upper intestine plays and a role that the lower intestine plays in terms of the rate at which the stomach empties. So one of the things when you're taking GLP-1 injections, they tell you don't take them for 2 weeks before surgery. Why? Because you may eat a meal 2 days before, and that meal may still be in your stomach when you're using high doses of GLP-1. It causes gastroparesis. So one of the side effects of taking exogenous GLP-1s is delayed gastric emptying and increased reflux, but that's not a side effect of the drug. It's in large part a side effect of the diet. So if there's certain foods that you're eating, high carbohydrate diets, you're going to have significant delayed gastric emptying and high reflux because you're triggering a massive spike of GLP-1. If you're eating protein and fat, you're not seeing the spike, you're just seeing a slow, steady release. So it's what you eat that causes the symptoms, not the GLP-1 itself. Hi folks, I don't eat on Mondays. Mondays are just no calorie Mondays. I go from Sunday night all the way through to Tuesday night, 48-hour fast. It's just a routine. It's not anything heroic. It's become a routine in my life. But there are days when, I don't know why, but I'm just dragging. There's a metabolic reason. There's a psychological reason. I'm just dragging. I'm not white knuckling. If I'm white knuckling, I'm going to eat. But there are days when I just need a little bump. And the key thing about my fast days, they're not about calories. They're about not triggering insulin. They're about remaining in fat-adapted ketosis or the fat utilization phase to optimize autophagy, mitochondrial repair, brain cell repair. And during those days, when I'm struggling a little bit in the afternoon, especially in the evening when I would ordinarily eat, I use a ketone IQ to bridge me across. It very rapidly bumps up my ketone level, and those ketone levels suppress my appetite. They trigger GLP-1, they suppress my appetite. They just take the edge off that desperate need to eat. Do I use it every week? No. But some weeks I'm just dragging, and this does not spike insulin. So your storage hormones are flat. Ketone IQ works to bridge across that moment where you need something, and you stay in fat utilization phase for 48 hours, optimizing metabolic recovery. Okay. So when you eat a small amount of carbohydrate, let's go through this. Carbohydrates, especially simple sugars, sharply and most potently trigger GLP-1's release in the upper intestine, and that GLP-1 release does two things in the pancreas. It causes a massive, significant spike in insulin release. So GLP-1s in humans triggers around 70 to 80% of the entire release of insulin, and GLP-1s at the upper intestinal level are releasing insulin in response to carbohydrate in the diet. And the simple sugars give you that spike. Simultaneously, the same GLP-1 that switches on insulin switches off glucagon release. So we've got a rise in a healthy person, a rise in insulin and a drop in a drop in glucagon. And that insulin then allows the liver to store the sugar as glycogen and allows the sugar that spills through the liver to the systemic circulation to be taken up by the largest repository of the human body for sugar, for glycogen, which is the muscles. And in order to get the sugar into the muscles, you need insulin. So GLP-1 spikes insulin. Insulin then concomitantly deals with the expected rise in blood sugar. I mean, that's just a beautiful and yet a very simple to understand system. Eat sugar. Sugar goes into your bloodstream. You need the hormone that distributes that. GLP-1 reacts to the amount of sugar and proportionately triggers the amount of insulin release. But the key thing here is that human beings need sugar, need a small amount of sugar to trigger GLP-1 to trigger 70 to 80% of the release of insulin. Other animals differ in that regard. Okay, so we see GLP-1s having a massive but short-lived spike. And that is optimally how we deal with sugar through insulin release and glucagon being shut off. At the same time, what that insulin does is it facilitates the uptake of fat in the fat cells and blocks the release of fat from the fat cells. Because you don't want double energy. So it allows us to use the sugar in the diet, blocks the fat, and works very hard in the liver and the muscles to form glycogen and to get the sugar into the muscle cells where it is also stored as glycogen. Okay. Then here's what's interesting is that fat in our diet particularly saturated fat, but fat in our diet travels through the intestine. Now, here's the cool thing about fat. In order to absorb fat into the human body, it has to be packaged in a package that can float in water. Fat is lipophilic. Water is hydrophilic, obviously. And so fat doesn't do well in an aqueous blood solution. So the cool thing about the human body is when you eat particularly fat, the gallbladder squeezes bile that's stored in the gallbladder. The bile comes to the upper intestine, interacts with the fat, and you form this little bubble called a bile micelle. And it's very similar to lipoproteins, very similar to LDL or VLDL. It's this little bubble of fat that is hydrophilic, water-loving on the outside, but fat-loving on the inside, and it forms a little soap bubble, and the fat in the gut that gets broken down into fatty acids and some triglycerides, but mostly fatty acids, gets plugged into that bile micelle, and that happens slowly over the course of the intestine. So you got free fat or big chunks of fat being broken down to individual fatty acids high up, no real triggering of hormones, and then as it travels to the lower intestine in those bile micelles, that complex triggers the second load of GLP-1, and it takes a longer period of time because there's a slower trickling. With the upper GLP-1, the sugar spike is high and short-lived. In the lower intestine, the fat in the bile micelles triggers GLP-1, but not in a spike, slowly over time. So there's what we call area under the curve. So the spike isn't quite as high of GLP-1, but the triggering result of the lower GLP-1 by fat and by micelles lasts much longer. And GLP-1 then facilitates the uptake of those biomicelles, of that fat, into chylomicrons that travel up the lymphatics and get deposited in the fat cells because of the nature of fat. But secondly, that GLP-1, that second slow rise of GLP-1 has a very profound effect on the hypothalamus of the brain that says, dude, you're full. It is an activator of the satiety center in the brain. So if you eat a high-fat meal, that goes through the intestine fairly quickly because it gets released from the stomach a little quicker. It triggers that slow GLP-1 later that then slows further gastric emptying, but it also triggers the brain to say, dude, I'm full. And that is how a ketogenic diet works. That is why a high-fat carnivore diet switches off appetite. I just don't feel hungry. But that is also how the administration of exogenous GLP-1, Ozempic, Mounjaro, that kind of thing, how it suppresses appetite. It's related to that second bolus of GLP-1 that goes up to the brain and says, dude, you're full. It triggers the satiety sensor, and a small amount of food makes you feel full for a long period of time. But you got to eat fat in order to do that. So if you're eating lettuce leaves and Oreo cookies, it ain't going to work so good. And you're going to feel sick to your stomach because the stomach is then delayed emptying. You're going to eat more. You're going to feel like crap. If you eat fat, you trigger a prolonged sense of satiety. So that's how GLP-1s work. And that they work even on a carnivore diet when you're eating a decent amount of fat. The fat is a good fuel source, but also it triggers that prolonged satiety and it reduces the spike in insulin. So you're not getting that massive spike in insulin if you're eating mostly fat, a little bit of an insulin trigger to cope with the amount of sugar in the liver, but not a massive amount of insulin. So you rapidly, if you're insulin resistant, you rapidly correct that. And if there's a little bit of sugar and a lot of fat, that is the optimal diet for humans because you're getting a little rise of insulin up front and a prolonged satiety effect on the back end where you're absorbing your biomicelles. Isn't that interesting? See how that works? And here's another interesting fact is that insulin also regulates, through that GLP-1 mechanism, the uptake of cholesterol from the gut. So if you are not triggering insulin because you're on a pure carnivore diet, your LDL and your total cholesterol goes up because you're not blocking that absorption. That's why your cholesterol goes up. Your cholesterol goes up on a pure carnivore diet, not because necessarily the production in the liver Not because of the production in the liver, but because there's not enough insulin to block the uptake. So in the LMHR people, they have high cholesterol because they're taking it all up because they're not triggering insulin. And that is a problem over time. But folks, that's what GLP-1s do. So the two areas where we trigger GLP-1 depends on our diet, and the ideal diet is a little bit of carbohydrate and a lot of fat. That's how it works. That's how we satisfy this. And then fat and bile in the lower intestine gives us a satiety. So if pure carnivores could spike insulin through GLP-1, they would have a massive drop in blood sugar because they're not turning protein into sugar very quickly. It's delayed. It's delayed. That's why GLP-1s in humans does not respond very much to amino acids, just a little bit. And in fact, the amino acid response happens more in the pancreas than in the gut. So if you eat lean protein, you don't get a GLP-1 response. Think that one through. And we did this experiment a while ago, and it failed. We looked at our carnivores that were the lean mass hyperresponders that were becoming insulin suppressed. And we said, well, blood sugar must trigger insulin. That was the misguided notion. Elevation in sugar triggers insulin. But it didn't. It didn't because it wasn't activating GLP-1. And what we found is those people eating a lean carnivore meat food, lean meat, were hungry all the time because they didn't have the fat to suppress the appetite. And their blood sugars were rising because they didn't have the insulin production from sugar to release the insulin to get rid of the sugar that the liver was turning into, where the liver was turning the excess protein to sugar. So too much protein is probably more harmful. No, not probably. On a carnivore-based diet, too much protein is way more harmful than too little. And yet the narrative on the internet is, more protein, you must eat more protein. Bullshit, you mustn't. More fat and a little bit of sugar. More fat and a little bit of sugar. And if that sugar comes in as dairy or some other form of sugar, so be it. It's to manipulate and manage GLP-1. So the paradox is that GLP-1 is released in response to sugar early as well as fat down the road in a very different way. Because the effect of the fat is much more prolonged, and this makes physiologic sense. And it's that fat also that then feeds back and delays gastric emptying and responsible both in the stomach and in the brain for the prolonged satiety that is triggered by fat in the hypothalamus of the brain as well as in the stomach. We need a small amount of insulin release, small amount of insulin early on to block lipolysis and get the fat stored in the adipocytes. So the combination of fat and sugar, a little bit of fat and a lot of fat and a little bit of sugar is the right way to go. So both Tro and I were correct that GLP-1's glucagon-like peptide number 1 is released in response to the ingestion of carbohydrates as well as fats and proteins, but carbohydrates are particularly effective at stimulating its release up front. Isn't that interesting? I love the way the human body works. So GLP-1s stimulate insulin secretion in a glucose-dependent way. And here's the other interesting thing, the cascade. When you trigger insulin, insulin regulates testosterone formation through the aromatase activity, triggers or stimulates the conversion of thyroid hormone T4 to the active thyroid hormone T3, stimulates human growth hormone release from the brain. So the 4 storage hormones are all triggered by GLP-1, triggered by sugar. Triggering GLP-1 triggers insulin. Insulin triggers testosterone formation, T3 formation from T4, and human growth hormone release, which are your storage hormones. And then as the sugar in the gut drops down, the GLP-1 signal goes down, your insulin level should go down, those storage hormones should go down, and then what is unregulated? Glucagon. So glucagon starts to rise as insulin falls, and you get into fat utilization phase. So that fat that you're absorbing down the bottom, you can then store in the fat cells, but also use as a fuel in your body. That cycling is crucial to being healthy. And my eating pattern reflects that. And my job as a physician is to help you to get into that cyclical pattern of eating with an appropriate diet. Not, oh, I must be carnivore, I must be vegetarian, I must be vegan. Understand how your body works. And that also, folks, once you understand that, is how to optimize metabolic correction, whether you want to lose weight, correct your type 2 diabetes, protect your heart, protect your kidneys, reduce Alzheimer's, by the use of exogenous GLP-1s. That is the optimal diet if you are going to include exogenous GLP-1s, semaglutide and Mounjaro and those kinds of drugs. However, the ideal thing is not to need them because your diet is good enough to use those that you produce inside your body. So that, folks, is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful explanation of how this all works. I am the Carb Addiction Doc. If you understand that, and you understand that you want to optimize your diet, not based on what gum flappers tell you on the internet, but based on the physiology of how your body works optimally, then we can help you to get there.